Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Broward County Library Facebook Live with Colombian writer William Castaño-Bedoya. This program will be presented in Spanish. Welcome to this program of the Broward County Library. My name is Freda Mosquera. I am a librarian, writer, translator, and manager of the Lauder Lakes Library of the Broward County Public Library System in South Florida. And we are broadcasting live through our Facebook and YouTube pages. Welcome, everyone. Well, I am pleased to greet today in this virtual space the writer William Castaño-Bedoya. William, how are you, and from where are you connecting with us for this virtual library?
Hello, Frida. How are you? Greetings to the audience. I am so happy to be with you, Frida, especially because it is you, a woman I have followed for so many years in that journey through literature and through events, and let's say that entire spectrum that unites us in culture. I am here in Coral Gables, Florida. We are by car about an hour away. You more to the north than I. I am a little to the south, and here, of course, to serve you. I am very happy to be with you.
I am also very happy, and I am very glad to have had the opportunity to know your work. I want to briefly share some biographical facts about you. William Castano-Bedoya was born in Armenia, the capital of the department of Quindío, in the heart of Colombia's coffee-growing axis. He studied marketing and advertising in Bogotá at the Universidad Jorge Tadeo Lozano, and then emigrated to the United States in the 1980s. And unlike the stories of other immigrants, with great tenacity and persistence, he managed to reconnect with himself and develop a career here in the United States in the field of advertising and marketing. He worked for several years, for quite a few years, with large corporations here in the United States. But at the beginning of the 21st century, he decided to embrace literature, which is his vocation. That is what he loves. But what makes him unique is that he brings with him all that knowledge he acquired in Colombia, at the university, in his professional practice, and then in the United States, having the experience of knowing the corporate world. And later on, when we talk about his works, we will discuss that a bit. In 2018, he decided to dedicate himself completely to writing, and there is a passage in his biography that I consider very important, the moment when he decided to create his own publishing house, Book&Bilias. We are going to talk about the publishing house. We are going to talk about his blog. It is also very important where he is writing his chronicles and sending them out. So, William, welcome. We are going to take a trip to our native Colombia, and we are going to travel imaginatively to Armenia, Quindío, because it is precisely there in the coffee-growing region where part of what would be your debut novel, Flowers for Maria Sucel, begins or develops. So if you could start us on that novel, how you began to write it, how many years it took you to finish it, and the different editions it has had.
Of course, Frida. You see, I began writing Flowers for Maria Sucel the very day my mother died at the Clínica de Marley in Bogotá, and she died in a way we did not expect. In other words, it was practically a very accidental death, a kind of medical malpractice. I do not blame the doctors, but I do place some blame on the technology that had just arrived and was very new. Because doctors, of course, do not stand before a patient to kill them, but to try to save them. The truth is, my mother became trapped in what was supposed to be a routine test and was induced into an acute pancreatitis that took her in 5 days. At that time, I was already prepared in the United States to bring her to live with me, and she was only 52 years old and had lived a very hard and sad life, often bedridden, of course, full of love, but burdened with much weight from life's circumstances. So after I returned to the United States, I began to work on Flowers, but I did not want to novelize a biography. I did not want a family biography, but I did want to write a novel. So I began to create and take very important elements from that life, not only from my mother, but also from my family and my ancestors. Let's say the story covers 90 years of a family from the coffee-growing region. 90 years. In those 90 years, there is a forced migration in 1966 of the family's core, which is what the novel absorbs as such. Maria Sucel, her husband, and their small children. Her husband is Gilberto, Years of vicissitudes follow from 1910 to 2004, tracing an intimate and social journey centered on Maria Sucel as a character, a woman who, in addition to being firmly rooted in the coffee region, comes with her husband and children. But her husband carries a double life that, to put it quickly, leads to great poverty in the capital. In other words, they go from that beautiful, wonderful countryside to a world of proletariat and suffering for the next 20 years. The novel continues in this way while Gilberto becomes an anti-hero, because they never abandon the love between them, but with all the flaws of that lineage, let's say the machista man, the submissive woman, all those traits of 20th century times, Gilberto ends up absorbing the emotional heart of the entire plot. That is Flowers for Maria Sucel, a journey through the life of a family that lives in exiles, the inner exiles.
Yes, that metaphor seems very beautiful to me. You explained to me that sometimes human beings have to go into exile, right? They have to travel, but on other occasions these exiles are internal.
Our own lives, the lives of all of us, are governed by a number of exiles. And to give a small example, although it is not explained as an exile within the novel. But when, over 20 years of the novel's life, we have come to discover that when the human being needs to take refuge in something, they go into exile. For example, I can exile myself in solitude as some inner exile, but I can also go into exile by going to other places, as I once did when I wanted to come to the United States. That was a voluntary exile. The most terrible exiles are the involuntary ones. The involuntary ones are those where you must go into exile, let's say, in sadness, because someone caused it to you, or because something caused it to you. But there are exiles that are voluntary, such as exiling oneself in solitude to read or to find comfort, and so on. So I say that although the word exile does not appear with nominal force, the exiles of the self are those inner movements, emotional displacements, and existential silences that expel the characters from themselves and from their bonds with their own desires. The novel shows you a bit of the way one flees forward, like Gilberto in a moment of despair, when he has already fled many times, has exiled himself by covering ground, exiles himself by seeking new lands, until he ends up exiled in Spiritism and begins reading the books of Kardec, waiting, let's say, for that cleansing of the soul he needs, supported by other things that perhaps for him psychologically help mitigate those needs of being somewhere else.
I will share here a sentence from the chapter titled Gilberto, where you say, "He became a kind of exile and devoted himself to wandering through towns and villages of the old Caldas, taking on any street job that came his way. Of them all, the one he liked the most was helping in bars to stay close to the women who frequented them. And since he preferred the nights for making a living, he charged the little drunks, unable to guide themselves, for accompanying them to their homes." Well, truly, the language of the novel is very polished. You can tell it was a novel built over a long time, not one that was written in a hurry.
It was very artisanal, and the challenge I had was to write, because it was my first novel. At that time, I was in the corporate world, serving my clients, serving companies. I traveled a lot. I spent my time either on a plane or in a hotel or in a conference room. And I remember that I wrote, for example, I would write at night in Trinidad and Tobago in a hotel on the top floor. Other nights I would write over there in a hotel in Tegucigalpa. But the most beautiful thing about all of this was that challenge I had. I want to tell you an anecdote. The first version I wrote of Flowers came out to 600 pages.
Wow.
But I began to doubt that it was 600 pages. I had no grounds to say whether it was good or bad, because my training as a writer has been more one of creative extraction. Not a training where I went to the university to study philology, letters, literature, many things. Nor that I had been a journalist for 30 years with stories ready to recreate in fiction or nonfiction. So many people who write like I do, who come from those creative spectrums of advertising and marketing, we have other sources of inspiration. I have always said that inspiration and creativity arise from research.
Yes, we have talked a little about the characters that readers will find, and also the geographical setting, the socioeconomic aspect. I would like you to briefly tell us what Colombia readers will find in Flores para Maria Sucel.
Well, geographically, the Colombia of the coffee growing region, practically that beautiful coffee countryside at its beginnings, when it started to be governed, let's say, by issues of public order, when the first bandits began to appear and harass the peasants who owned their land. That coffee growing region is still preserved somewhat clean. But when one goes to the city, Bogota is too hostile for people who arrive with that innocence still clinging to their skin. A moment begins in which the family sinks completely into great need. The children are brought to the forefront. But traditions came along with the family, so much so that Maria Sucel ends up having 8 children and 2 miscarriages. And the miscarriages happen when she wakes up a bit and says no more, because she does not want to be the submissive woman of the coffee region anymore. She already knows she must get up, get ready, and take a bus to work 12 or 15 hours and return while the old man, the father, is not there. So, what happens? There comes a moment in which that woman transforms. More than representing a woman from Armenia or Bogota, she represents a woman from Latin America. And that is where I begin to value my travels through Latin America, because I see Maria Sucels in every town.
How beautiful, William.
I do not see them here in the United States. This is something else. Here I do not see Maria Sucels. Here people suffer from other things. They do not suffer the way people suffer there.
In a certain way, the writing of that novel was your inner exile during that time.
Yes, I see it as an exile. I also see it as a need to honor men and women in Latin America. Because think about it, Gilberto ends his life bedridden, 16 years living in the same house as his children and Maria Sucel, but they never speak to each other again.
Well, let's leave the readers the opportunity to discover the plot. Flowers for Maria Sucel is available in different formats, in print edition, in digital edition, and for the patrons of the Broward County Public Library, they can access it through our Hoopla program. We move from this novel, which takes place entirely in Colombia, to a novel more cosmopolitan, but in another socio-economic setting, the monologues of Ludovico. So in the monologues of Ludovico, you are no longer that omniscient narrator, that historian who goes back and creates a fiction from those family memories, but instead you construct a fascinating novel through the eyes of a very singular character, Ludovico. Let's talk about Ludovico, from the monologues of Ludovico.
Well, I want to tell you that Ludovico is a story that spans about 44 years of existence, let's say between 1968 and 2012. The existence is because Ludovico appears in the novel already as a man of 44 years. And who is Ludovico? There is a hereditary mental condition that arrives in Colombia, coming from the Spanish colonization. We are talking about the colony. That condition is called Fragile X. Fragile X is a disorder of the chromosomes, and it comes from the X chromosome. It is an aberration, so to speak, without being scientific. The truth is that it generates human beings absolutely beautiful in their human condition as persons. We cannot say it is Down syndrome because it is not. We cannot say it is autism because it is not.
Sorry, how do you spell the mental condition?
In Spanish, it is called X, the X, and fragile from fragility, fragile. Well, the interesting thing about this condition is that it has a wide spectrum. You may have been born with the syndrome in a very chronic way, where you can hardly fend for yourself, or you may have a spectrum where certain things you can do on your own, like bathing yourself. The character I analyzed for so many years, and whom I extrapolate in this novel, knows how to count to 10. He knows how to write the repeated names of the family, a number of things. But at the same time, the great paradox is that this character, who narrates his own reality in interior monologues, and who moreover narrates them within a spectrum of incomprehension of what he hears or what he sees, cannot properly narrate what he means to say because he has apraxia. When he tries to say something, he does not interpret it the way the brain orders him to. He's a character from a wealthy family.
From Antioquia, a family from Antioquia.
It turns out that all the brothers are around the world. He is the last of the family, and his two parents are octogenarians. And the great dilemma is, what will happen to Ludovico when the old ones die? At some point, I mentioned to you that this plot was going to be called When the Old Ones Die instead of Ludovico.
Yes.
So the family gathers to analyze what to do when the old ones die. But Ludovico does not understand the meetings, nor does he understand the conversations, and Ludovico creates his own imagination of what is happening. That is part of a psychological fiction which, when you read it, is very entertaining because it makes you cry or it makes you laugh.
Yes, because Ludovico believes they are talking about a piece of furniture.
Exactly. That is a leitmotif because they dissuade him when he asks, What? What? They say, no, the mother's furniture, Medellin. But the mother's furniture in Medellin is him.
Could we read a paragraph?
A paragraph from Ludovico?
Yes, a paragraph from Ludovico to show the readers a bit how the monologues are written, right?
Okay, let's read a little. The first monologue is called Monologues of the First Day.
Yes.
And the monologues of the first day narrate the nervousness he feels on the plane when that blessed thing lands. It is a nervousness that never goes away, even though he has been a man who has traveled all over the world because his family takes him everywhere on trips. He begins to express what he felt as a sensation when arriving at the airport. He says a curse. What at the hell? I exclaimed. It was the only thing I could say when the plane touched Miami and shook as if it were falling apart, rolling and rolling very, very fast on that ground, fighting with that proud, harassing, pissed-off wind, because the plane had arrived without asking its permission and without wanting to stop. And we, in that plane, making an effort to help it not go so fast, or to make it go slower, and on, with that wind that roared and screeched furiously because the plane wanted to beat it. Uff, what a huge urge to pee I felt, and I squeezed my buttocks and pressed my knees together not to do it, just as my old lady tells me when I am far from a bathroom. And I kept anguished, feeling the plane would not stop because the wind had the upper hand. I began to sweat, and I looked at my old lady, and she looked at me terrified, wishing I wouldn't get scared, because that foolish fit can come over me when I get frightened. And even though that beast was losing strength because the wind began to win, I kept sweating, and my armpits itched, and I had to scratch until I felt light without so much weight on my neck. And that even though I don't sweat that much because it doesn't come out when I am overheated from the jogs I take through Comuna 13, or because I'm having that foolish fit. The foolish fit he has is that Ludovico, when he feels he is not understood, or when he is already tired of not understanding what is happening, begins to go into a nervous crisis and convulses, and it only passes when his mother gives him a little pill to calm him down. And after the pill, he asks his mother to take him to Mass.
I have not known many novels that are written this way. I read one some years ago from the point of view of a woman who has the condition of bipolarity, and she tells how her life is. But I had not had access to a novel in which, so realistically, it shows what the world of a person who sees it differently is truly like. So I believe that is the great achievement of this beautiful novel. I invite you to read The Monologues of Ludovico. It is also translated into English. It is available in digital version through the catalog of the Broward County Library. And those people who want to access the library collection and who are not residents of the county can also obtain the card online that will give them access to that very large collection we have. I want to tell you there is a female character. If you could tell us, William, about that girl he loves. Briefly.
Ludovico is the central character, but Ludovico is always narrating about two women who are the support of his life. One, the physical support, is his mother, who is octogenarian, who for 44 years has carried him through life up to the moment where they are, but they are deciding that she can no longer go on. Ludovico, at 44 years old, is in full possession of his lucidity and intelligence, but he can't live alone, so he falls in love. Keep in mind, He's a sexually developed man, but mentally he's still like a 10-year-old child. The novel touches tangentially on the issue of libido, how he experiences it. He falls in love with a little girl he sees while walking through the comunas and the streets of Medellin. She's a young woman who greets him every day. Her name is Amparo. He idealizes her for his entire life. And during his trip to the United States, he relates everything he sees back to her. He's monogamous by nature, a result of the example set by his parents, who were never separated. So, even when he feels tempted by other women in his imagination, he replaces their faces with Amparo's because he doesn't want to betray her. There are many moments like that, and as you read, you begin to see everything that makes up his human condition. In those pages, you may even find reflections of your own soul.
William, the next novel you publish is already set in the United States, but it still keeps a connection with Latin America, which is El Galpón, a novel that is also translated into English, and which is also available in print format and in digital format. El Galpón. In El Galpón, you present to us other characters who move within the business world. And in this novel, you create, like the great writers, your own imaginary towns. In this case, let's say your Macondo is a company, a business called Hansen Box.
The company has a German name because its owner is a German immigrant who, let's say, begins a very small venture in a corner of Miami near the airport with a very small logistics company.
Let's see if you can tell us a little about how curious this duo is that forms in Hansen Box.
In fact, Hansen Box arises from a need to bring together so many anecdotes and so many experiences lived while traveling through Latin America, and in my last 10 years, practically helping large companies build strategic alliances to broaden each one's international market reach. I was inspired by knowing so many things about so many geographies and also by being able to interpret those historical moments. Let's say I published it in 2023. It narrates 4 decades of corporate or business history from 1988 to 2018. It takes place within a multinational that collapses, victim of its own success. This is key. Success in a company must be leveraged with much wisdom, because success can bury you.
William, I would like you to tell me about the characters.
Ethan Bondaberry is an American of Spanish Basque origin. He is a man who serves in the novel as the manager, a good person who carries on his shoulders the company of the owner, who is Adolf Hansel. Yes, he is a man to whom the owner hands over the company so that he manages it because the owner is absolutely disconnected, a feudal type, who does not get involved in the company but pays this man to run it. It turns out that this man, with the help of Oliver, who is an external consultant, manages to take this company very high across a geography that is continental. This company operates with the United States as its epicenter, but it unfolds activity. I will read them, because I forget. Brazil, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Panama, Honduras, Venezuela, Argentina, and Chile. But in that trajectory of those 4 decades, conflicts arise that wound the American market deeply. One of them was the arrival of socialism of the 21st century in Venezuela, which destabilized the entire region and hurt many commercial interests of American companies in Latin America. There is a great struggle. 2 characters function throughout the novel as alter egos. Ethan is of an ultra-conservative cut. He is a man who only serves the ultra-conservative causes of the United States. And they have, I think, the historical mistake in the novel of bringing their ideologies into the heart of their companies, reaching the point of spilling over to all their employees and collaborators. That constant influence of such radical ideologies even ruins a number of their international business deals.
Sorry to interrupt you, but could we say then that it is a kind of visionary novel?
Absolutely. Notice that as the novel unfolds and the political dialogue sits at the corporate negotiation tables, things do not work well. The message is, do not mix politics with your business, because politics goes forward, but your business sinks.
Do not confuse public management with private management.
You are absolutely right.
I have a comment in the chat. but it takes us a little away from El Galpón and brings us back again to Ludovico. I would like to know, what was your source of inspiration for a character like Ludovico?
I will answer right away. By observing a person very closely for more than a decade, sharing with him. But also, I remember that on a trip I took from San Jose, Costa Rica, to Miami, returning from a mission, I was seated with a lady who confessed to me that she had a son with the syndrome in San Jose, and she told me his life, and we became friends. I did not know that Ludovico would have that syndrome. After I finished the novel, I realized that it was the presence of the syndrome, which is not autism, which is not Down syndrome, it is Fragile X, when I began to investigate it more scientifically. Why? Because Ludovico physically does not have Down. Ludovico physically in his gaze is not autistic. Ludovico is a different person.
The most beautiful thing about the novel is that, and also the change in the language. We have to be very careful with words and how we use them, because people live with mental conditions.
Freda, to close this quickly, I became friends with a technology man of Mexican origin who has a son with a condition that is not Fragile X, but rather a severe autism. This son turns 18 and begins to grow much bigger than his father, his mother, and his little sister. And the autism is so severe that this boy begins to punish his parents because he has excessive strength. That family begins to live a true chaos, and I begin to extract the theme of Ludovico in those moments of great frustration when he goes mad. Because Ludovico has moments of madness. So, what happens? He is a character built from a number of pieces of evidence that I bring into fiction, with the treatment already as characters.
How beautiful. How beautiful. I would like to explain to the readers what a galpón is. We know what a galpón is. We know what a galpón is. But why is the novel called El Galpón?
Well, first of all, because I loved El Túnel by Sabato, and to speak of El Túnel and of Sabato was to speak of something specific that carries many connotations through the novel itself. But I began to think of El Galpón because 70% of the plot takes place during that entire transformation of Venezuela from socialism almost to communism. It embraces the deep left and, of course, the rejection of everything that was foreign commercial norms. The airports are closed, the crisis arrives, all of that costs Hansenbox, costs it great alliances at a global level. That is where all that commercial paradise begins to collapse. It is a very interesting novel for people who study business administration, economics, technology, macroeconomics.
I would say for any reader, because in some way we experience the changes in the market. So, in our daily life, even if we sometimes do not understand what is happening, we still experience the changes. I would like to remind you that the novel has a glossary, right?
Yes, it has a glossary of terms because a lot of jargon from different Latin American countries is used, even American jargon. But I want to close the subject of why it is called El Galpón. It turns out that as a result of the referendum, Venezuelans in one night bought everything they could not buy in a year. If the referendum passed, they would lose that benefit. So there was a tsunami of logistics, and it turns out that for Venezuelans, the place where goods are stored is called Los Galpones. For us in Colombia, maybe a chicken coop, but there are other connotations as well. That is why it was titled El Galpón. It is like that physical space where the novel unfolds with packages and things.
Yes. I believe you also break with that stereotype of the Latin American writer who, when in the United States, writes about the same themes. It is important that all of this we have lived through during all these last years here in South Florida is now present in the pages of your novels. And so we move quickly to The Beggars of the Mercury Lights, We the Other People, which is your most recent published novel. It is also in English and takes place in Dade County. Ah, you bring us a character, Steve Newman, his last name Newman. Newman.
It is an American novel, and I want to tell it to you this way because I know time is running. The Beggars of the Mercury Lights takes place between 2016 and 2020, when the United States enters a very serious socio-political era. Very serious, and one we are still living through. The United States is in a very difficult transformation. People, especially the most vulnerable, are suffering greatly. There is a power that is suffocating not only for migration, but for the entire world. Tariffs, protectionism, but at the same time, that cult of great wealth that wants to govern forever and become richer every single day. So it is a social theme. This novel is a novel with a very strong social stance, a completely American novel in its characters, in its customs, and in its plots.
I would say that more than calling it a gringo novel, it is telling the world of an Anglo-American man who lives in Dade County, in Miami, a millionaire who suffers from depression and whose decline leads him to become a driver.
A driver in Miami-Dade County, which is like 10 or 15 incorporated cities within what is one great Miami-Dade County, has to move all day in every direction and knows what it is to live on the street. He knows whom to pick up and whom not to pick up. In fact, this driver feeds on the rumors that the very passengers tell. They may be extravagant things, sad things, joyful things. In other words, it is an adventure to live through that. But this character does not feed on that. He begins to analyze what the most vulnerable people suffer from, and he comes to recognize how, in a city like Miami, which is so glamorous, there is so much poverty, so much prostration, so much indifference, and there is. In other words, there is an underworld that suffers tremendously.
I would also like you to briefly tell us the historical period, because there are many historical events.
The novel begins in 2016. When the pandemic arrives, this character is overcoming his depression, which lasted almost 3 years, when he almost became a beggar, just another beggar. And he becomes a driver because he is advised to do something mechanical that does not make him think. When he was rich, he dedicated himself to raising money for candidates for power in Florida on behalf of the Republican Party. In other words, he is a Republican who, when he is poor, realizes the indifference of people who believe themselves rich toward the reality of the people. So he becomes a man full of compassion for those who are truly suffering. And the suffering is laid bare through the pandemic, because the pandemic accentuates those sufferings, and he begins to detect where the abuses of power from power itself are found. The very people who work, millions of them, who work in the United States to keep this nation going are the ones being harmed. I do not want to give away too many details, but I do invite you to discover how this character, in his madness of transformation after 300 pages, ends up proposing changes to the Constitution of the United States.
We will leave that for the readers to discover. I have a comment from Elvira Sanchez Blake. She says, an important element of the novel We the Other People, the Beggars of the Mercury Lights, is the situation of the homeless. I would like to know the process of writing about this subject.
There are categories among the homeless, but in the novel, the pandemic leaves behind an additional number beyond those who already exist. Let's say that driver parks the car and chats with them, talks with them. But it turns out that during the pandemic, in the neglect that exists, the working people who live from their wages do not receive government aid. Why? Because they created a software that cost $77 million so that people could not process it easily, with the blessed paranoia that everyone who comes to Miami comes to live off the government, and that is false. Because the people who are working here, who have their documents, their residency, their citizenship, who one day need to claim their unemployment insurance, have the constitutional right to do so. But there is a paranoia in power that tries to control too much. It turns out that when the pandemic hits and that is exposed and they cannot use the software, when do they fix software from one day to the next? They cannot, they have to make another. A new generation of homeless emerges, and it is many working people who have to leave their apartments and go live with their children in their own cars to avoid paying rent during the pandemic. It was a great reality that if you go into the news, let's say CNN or Fox, and analyze what happened with unemployment in Florida, you will read what I am narrating to you here through fiction. So it truly is a raw novel that tells the reality of what one would never imagine could happen in such a glamorous place in the world as Miami-Dade County.
To be able to close this conversation with William Castaño-Bedoya in a spectacular way, your most recent novel, We'll Meet in Stockholm, you are a special case from different points of view. On one hand, your themes move away from the stereotypes of what is considered the Latin writer in the United States. You move away from those themes. You speak of other subjects that are current and that touch us and affect us all. So they are very contemporary novels. In We'll Meet in Stockholm, you move the plot to New Orleans, and all that experience you have acquired as a writer, who consolidates himself as an independent writer. Your knowledge of the world of advertising, the creation of your own publishing house, Book&Bilias, leads you to write this metaphor of what is the life of the writer, the struggle of the writer.
Truly, my condition as an independent writer in the United States is a bit different from the independent writer, let's say, in Latin America. Let's say that the writer in Latin America lives in his city, in his town, and when he finishes a work, usually someone helps him to have it published. In the United States, you have no one. You are independent, and you stop being independent only if you become part of the 1% of all writers in the United States. But I will give you a fact. Every year, 500,000 literary works are released in the United States, of which only 1% manage to be taken on by a publishing house. If you are the 99% in a world as complex as the American or the global one, when you become a writer, you have to suffer the solitude of writing. I chose the French Quarter of New Orleans, where the community of independent writers recreates its conflicts in a large house. Here, the relationship between gender and protagonism is much greater. There are men marked by the search, by failure, and by the self. All writers have something of each of the characters.
People want to hear more from you. Who are those 6 characters?
There is Lucas Thompson, an American who comes from the north of the United States, looking in New Orleans for that romanticism to become a writer, and he joins the gathering as the youngest of them all. There is Charlie Monroe, a 77-year-old man who keeps in his house 20 manuscripts of novels and who spends his time in the gathering polishing those manuscripts. There is Nicolas Sinclair in his 60s, who has spent many years sending letters to publishers with his manuscripts, beautiful prose, and it turns out that neither the publishers give him any attention, nor do the literary agents, who are already disappearing. They almost do not exist, and the few that do have on their web pages a message that says, "If we have not answered you in 6 months, please do not insist." There is Gabriel Turner, who in the gathering is a man in his 50s, who boasts of having studied literature, who emerges as that character who governs them all, who dictates technique, but in reality what he does is create much insecurity in the improvisation of the novelists who come to the gathering. So it is a plot that takes you from one side to another. And there is, of course, Nora Patel, a woman who suffers a great disappointment and is writing her first novel. She is very talented. And there is also Maya Roberts, a great poet inspired by a friend of mine who died of cancer, who was a poet. Maya Roberts ends up dying, and she is the one who expresses that satirical phrase of the title, who says, "We'll meet in Stockholm," as if telling the writers, keep working, because someday you will win a Nobel Prize.
What I have seen, William, and what I congratulate you for, is for the quality of the texts, the care in the texts, but also the quality of the editions. As a librarian, I greatly appreciate and value that great effort not only to impose yourself in the publishing market in an independent way, but also to preserve the quality in the text and in the publications. And we have 1 minute left. I want to invite everyone to visit the blog of William Castaño-Bedoya. If you could tell us, William, how often do you publish your chronicles?
Well, I usually publish every 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the intensity. My therapy is to walk 3 miles near where I live, by the University of Miami or around the area, and I use these walks to think, to philosophize. Sometimes I am accompanied by characters. I go talking with Plato. Sometimes I go talking with my own alter ego. Sometimes I talk with Flaubert, or sometimes I talk with other writers I have touched upon. These days I went talking with Dante Alighieri about the Divine Comedy because I am writing something that has to do with those fantastic worlds of the Divine Comedy, and many times I also speak for my chronicles. I have often used my dialogues with Orwell, Animal Farm, and his dystopian novels.
It is very easy to find William's website. You only have to type his name, William Castano-Bedoya. You will find the website. You will find all his books, how the books can be purchased, but you will also have access to the blog, and the page is in English and in Spanish. So in the top right corner, you can change the language of the page. It is a very beautiful page, very well built, and also very easy to navigate. And I want to remind you that you can access William's works through our Hoopla application. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for this encounter, for being able to share with me during this time, during these days, for getting to know your work, and now having the perspective that I will continue reading it. I am very, very grateful that you accepted my invitation, and, well, I wish you much success. I want this program to be a window so that readers who have not yet read you will read you. Would you like to say a few last words, William?
That I love you very much, Freda, as well as all the people who, in one way or another, have reached out. And please, you can contact me to keep talking if there are any questions left.
Thank you very much.